This is Lazzaro Spallanzini, an Italian priest and biologist that lived in the 18th century. One evening he noticed that barn owls could perfectly navigate in dim candlelight. But the moment the candle was blown out, they crashed into walls. So he tried the same experiment with bats. On August 20th, 1793, he wrote, "The candle was taken away, yet the animals continued to fly around as before and never struck against obstacles. Even in complete darkness, the bats flew flawlessly. He even went as far as surgically removing the eyes of one of the bats, but to his astonishment, it still flew perfectly normal." Following these observations, he did some more experiments and found out that the bats were very disorientated when they had their ears plugged. He concluded that the ears seemed to be very important for navigation, whereas the eyes didn't seem to matter at all. But he failed to explain how their ears could help them see, and this led to a 150-year-long mystery that was finally solved in 1938. Donald Griffith was an American zoologist that lived in the 20th century. Using the world's first ultrasound microphone developed by G.W. Pierce, he was finally able to resolve the mystery of how bats were able to fly in complete darkness. He found that when he held the microphone directly in front of flying bats, it would pick up consistent high-frequency sounds. This led to a number of following experiments, and in 1944 he coined the term echolocation. Since then we have learned a lot about this phenomenon and about the animals that use it. Echolocation, also called biosonar, is a form of biological active sonar that is used by some animals. Animals that are capable of this unique ability can emit calls and then listen to the echoes that come back from the varying objects around them to navigate their surroundings. Ranging is achieved by measuring the time delay between the animal's own sound emission and the echoes that come back. Depending on the species, these calls can vary greatly in frequency. But the main idea is that high frequencies provide good detail for close-up and smaller objects, while lower frequencies travel further and detect larger objects. The calls of bats have been most intensively studied, but this principle applies to all echolocation calls. Echolocation evolved a number of times independently from each other, and it is therefore a great example of convergent evolution, which is the term that biologists use to describe independent evolution of similar features in species of different lineages. These three species, for example, all developed white fur to fit into their snowy environments since it was beneficial, but they are not closely related. Most people probably know that echolocation can be found in bats and whales, and although these two groups are definitely the most sophisticated users of echolocation, there are some other species that have also developed this ability. When we talk about other mammals, for example, we can see that there's a few small mammals where this ability has emerged as well. But it's not just the mammals. We also know of two bird species that are capable of echolocation. For each of these species, there's a slightly different answer to how this came to be. And it becomes clear very quickly that the complexity of echolocation varies a lot between these species. If we take a look at the most rudimentary forms of echolocation, then we're speaking about the two bird species that I mentioned earlier, the South American oilbird and some species of cave swiftlets. These birds live in dark caves just like bats do, and this already gives some hints about how they develop this ability. Echolocation research in the last 25 years has mainly focused on bats and whales, which is why there's still a lot that is unknown about echolocation in birds. But as of now, it is believed that these birds don't use echolocation for hunting, but mostly for navigation. The clicks that these birds produce are low enough for humans to hear them, which is why they are not very good for close-up or detailed pictures of their environment. Tests have shown that it is difficult for these birds to locate objects that are smaller than 20 centimeters in diameter, which makes sense considering that they use lower frequencies than bats, for example. Birds produce their echolocation signals in an organ called the syrinx. This is a vocal organ specific to birds, and it is found near to where the trachea forks into the lungs. For detecting the echoes that come back, they use their ears, and this is where we run into the first problem. Upon analyzing the anatomy of the inner ear, it became clear that they do not have highly specialized ears such as bats do for detecting very high frequencies. So it is believed that even if they could emit higher frequencies than they do now, they wouldn't be able to hear them, so it wouldn't really serve any purpose. The evolutionary path for echolocation in birds is likely relatively simple. These birds already lived in dark caves where vision becomes almost useless. It is thought that their echolocation calls evolved from ordinary vocalization calls that were originally used for communication between the individuals in the dark. Over time, individuals that could better interpret echoes coming back from the cave walls had a survival advantage, since they were less likely to collide with obstacles. And this gradual refinement may have led to these basic forms of echolocation that we see in these birds nowadays. It is good enough for navigation, but not detailed enough to hunt insects mid-flight, for example. But it still remains a tantalizing question why this ability evolved in some lineages and not in others, since there's other birds which nest in dark caves that don't have this ability. Still though, it is remarkable to see such a unique ability evolve in a group other than the mammals. And research on echolocating birds still has a long way to go. But when it comes to mammals, not all of them use a very complicated form of echolocation. Shrews are small, mole-like mammals that have small eyes and generally poor vision. Conveniently, some of them have developed the ability to use echolocating calls for their navigation. They make a range of high-pitched twittering, squeaking and chirping calls, and studies suggest that some of these high-frequency sounds are used for echolocation. But just like the birds, they do not use this ability for hunting, but mostly for close-up navigation of dark or complex environments. The small vocalizations that they constantly emit as they move through dense vegetation or dark tunnels may have provided them with useful echo information, even if only at very short distances. And just like with the birds, natural selection over time would favor the individuals that were better at interpreting these echoes and navigate their surroundings, gradually turning simple noise into a crude navigational tool. Tenrecs are small mammals endemic to Madagascar, and they come in a wide variety of different phenotypes. Take the lowland streaked tenrecs, for example. These small animals are covered in spines, which are mostly used for defense. However, some of these spines have another use. The group of closely gathered spikes on their lower back can be rubbed together to create very high ultrasonic sounds. It is thought that they might be using these sounds to communicate with each other, for example when trying to find one another in the dense vegetation. If they are actually using this for communication, then tenrecs would be the only mammal to communicate this way, since stridulation is mostly found in other insects like cicadas, for example, but not in mammals. Regarding the Chinese pygmy dormice, very little is known about their echolocation. Just like shrews, they produce high-frequency calls, likely as a byproduct of communication or when they're in distress. However, due to the lack of detailed studies, this remains largely speculative. In all of these cases, echolocation evolved gradually from simple sounds to secondary functions. But in bats and whales, something completely different happened. In these groups, echolocation developed into a highly sophisticated and complex system that they can use for active hunting. They are capable of detecting tiny prey, tracking movement, and effectively seeing with sound. Bats are perhaps one of the most unusual and specialized mammals on Earth. They are the only mammals that are capable of active flight, and additionally, some of them are capable of highly specialized echolocation. It is this flight and echolocation that is responsible for their global success, and it explains how they were able to conquer the night skies all over the world. The long-held popular belief was that bats can be neatly divided into two groups: the megabats, also called Megachiroptera, and the microbats, also called Microchiroptera. Without modern genetic sequencing, this classification made a lot of sense. You have the Megachiroptera, which are largely Old World fruit bats like flying foxes, which don't really use echolocation but rely mostly on vision and smell. And then you have the smaller Microchiroptera, which rely mainly on echolocation and use it for active hunting of insects. So for quite some time, scientists assumed that the bat family tree looked something like this one group with bats that don't really echolocate, and then another group with smaller bats that rely mainly on echolocation. But as you've probably guessed, evolution is rarely this simple. So with the rise of modern genetic sequencing, it became clear that this classification wasn't entirely accurate. Modern genetic studies show that bats actually divide into two completely different groups: Ynterochiroptera and Youngochiroptera. And this time there is no easy distinction when it comes to echolocation in these two groups of bats. Because the group of Ynterochiroptera contains both bats that use echolocation and ones that for the most part don't echolocate. Horseshoe bats, for example, are part of this group, and they have one of the most complex forms of echolocation that we know of. The difficulty is that flying foxes also belong to this group, and they don't really use echolocation at all. They rely mainly on their sense of smell and vision. The other groups of bats, the Youngochiroptera, all use echolocation without exception. So now we have a group of bats that use echolocation and another group where some of them echolocate and others don't. And all of this raises the question, did the common ancestor of all bats already use echolocation and then it was lost in some of the species like the flying fox, for example, or did echolocation evolve independently several times in bats? At the moment, these are the two main theories. The first theory suggests that the common ancestor of bats already used laryngeal echolocation, meaning that they produced these echolocation calls using an organ called the larynx. This is a muscular organ which is located in the throat and it is mainly used for vocalization, and it can be found in all mammals. In bats, this is a highly specialized organ, used to produce intense high-frequency ultrasonic pulses of up to 140 decibels for laryngeal echolocation. The only two exceptions are found in the Ynterochiroptera. According to this idea, the ancestors of flying foxes then later lost this ability, possibly because they became more dependent on vision for fruit feeding and alive in the trees. Some studies also suggest that flying foxes still possess remnants of genetic pathways that are associated with echolocation. This would support that they had this ability but then lost it later. But there's also another theory, which is that complex laryngeal echolocation evolved several times in bats. One reason for this idea is that different bat groups use very different forms of echolocation. The anatomy of the inner ear also differs a lot from group to group. So currently there's no complete agreement about this, but I personally think that the first theory is a lot more logical. Because to me it makes a lot of sense that very different echolocation systems evolve depending on where the bat is actually hunting. Bats that hunt in open air often use lower frequency calls, which travel further but provide less detail. Forest-dwelling bats instead use shorter, high-frequency sounds, which are better for a more detailed understanding of close-up objects. This allows them to navigate through dense vegetation and also to detect tiny insects. Some species can even modulate and change their calls in real time. While searching for prey, they emit calls relatively slowly, but once they detect an insect, the calls increase rapidly to what scientists call the feeding buzz. At this point, the bat updates information about the prey's position at about 200 images per second. But even more remarkably, some moths developed ears that are capable of hearing bat ultrasound, and others perform evasive dives or just erratic flight patterns to avoid the bats. But in my opinion, the most impressive are the tiger moths, which can produce high-frequency clicks themselves. These clicks are believed to be able to jam the bat's own sonar, which makes it difficult for them to detect the moth. All of this led to an evolutionary arms race between predator and prey, which has likely lasted for tens of millions of years. But bats are only half of the story. Far away from the forests and the caves, another group of mammals independently evolved the ability to use echolocation. Toothed whales, also known as odontocetes, include dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales and orcas. Just like bats, they rely on echolocation not only for navigation but also for hunting. Light is absorbed very quickly in the ocean, which is why it becomes darker the deeper you go. Sound, however, travels nearly 5 times as fast in water as it does in the air, and it can propagate over enormous distances. So for an aquatic predator, sound is a great sensory tool. Whale echolocation likely evolved after the ancestors of modern whales returned to the ocean around 50 million years ago. These ancestors were originally land mammals related to even-toed ungulates, like hippos for example, which by the way are whales' closest living relatives. In general, whale evolution is a super interesting topic, so if you're interested in that, let me know if I should make a video about that. Modern toothed whales produce echolocation clicks inside a structure located beneath the blowhole known as the phonic lips. The sound is then focused through a large fatty organ in the forehead, called the melon. The melon acts almost like an acoustic lens, shaping and forming the sonar beam. The returning echoes are primarily received through the lower jaw, which contains specialized fat channels that conduct sound toward the middle ear. And the precision of this system is extraordinary. Experiments with dolphins showed that they can distinguish between objects that differ only by a few millimeters in size. They are even capable of detecting different material density, allowing them to differentiate between wood, metal or plastic, purely through sound. And sperm whales push the system to an even more extreme limit. These whales can dive as deep as 2,000 meters into almost complete darkness. Here they use echolocation clicks, which are amongst the loudest biological sounds ever recorded. Their clicks reach up to 230 to 236 decibels, which is louder than a jet engine or a rocket launch. And these immense acoustic pulses help them to locate giant squid deep in the abyss. So sperm whales are a great example that they don't just use this for navigation, but for active hunting. Bats and whales evolved these systems independently, yet ended up sharing surprisingly similar genetic changes. One of the most important discoveries in the last 2 decades involves a protein called prestin. Prestin is a motor protein found inside specialized cells of the inner ear called outer hair cells. These cells physically expand and contract in response to sound vibration, essentially amplifying incoming sound. And this mechanism is especially important for detecting extremely high frequencies, which are crucial for echolocation. When scientists compared the genomes of bats and echolocating whales, they discovered something remarkable concerning the prestin protein in their ears. Although these animals are only very distantly related, their prestin genes had evolved highly similar mutations independently, and this became one of the best examples of molecular convergent evolution. As a quick honorable mention, I just wanted to say that there's also some humans which are blind that have learned the ability of echolocation, which I find very impressive. They are able to use echolocating clicks that they make with their tongues to detect the size and distance of objects, which is insane to me. Like I said in the beginning, we have learned a lot about echolocation and all the animals that use it, but despite decades of research, there is still a lot that is unknown about echolocation in animals, and many questions still remain unanswered. Scientists still debate how many times echolocation evolved in bats, whether early whales possessed primitive sonar systems, and how neural circuits in the brain can process such enormous amounts of acoustic information at the same time. A bat flying through the forest at night does not experience the world as darkness. It experiences a constantly updating acoustic map built entirely from reflected sounds. And somewhere in that darkness, through millions of years of evolution, natural selection turns sound itself into vision. These videos take a lot of work in both research and the visualization, so if you've enjoyed it and you're interested in biology, then feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a like down below.